The birth of Jesus is one of the most controversial of the events described in the New Testament. The gospel accounts of Jesus' birth are frequently attacked by sceptics and by critics, but their criticisms are usually based on a very shallow look at the evidence. In this video, we're going to look at the evidence, we're going to examine the criticisms, and we're going to show that the gospel accounts are rather more reliable than you might think. So subscribe to the channel, press the notify button, and off we go. Let's look first of all at the events that surround the birth of Jesus. These are written in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Luke. It starts off with Joseph and Mary in Nazareth, where they get engaged to be married. An angel then arrives and tells Mary that she's going to have a baby, even though there's no man involved. Mary becomes pregnant by a miracle. She goes off and visits a relative for a little while and comes back to Nazareth. And then Herod the Great, the king of the area, decrees there's going to be a census. Joseph and Mary have to travel from Nazareth down to Bethlehem, and they go there for the census. And sometime after they arrive, Jesus is born in Bethlehem. This is followed by a visit from shepherds who've been in the fields looking after their sheep. They come to look at the baby Jesus. Jesus is taken to the temple where he's presented as the law of Moses required. They then start to live in Bethlehem. At this point, they're visited by some wise men who've come in from the east. The wise men have been to Jerusalem, and they have inadvertently alerted Herod the Great, a very paranoid king, to the fact that a new king is being born in Bethlehem, and Herod does what he can to stop that. But warned in a dream, Joseph and Mary take Jesus and they go away to Egypt. Herod the Great sends his soldiers, they kill small children in Bethlehem, hoping to catch the new Messiah, although they've actually in reality missed him. And then Herod the Great dies. Joseph and Mary bring Jesus back from Egypt, but they don't stop in Bethlehem. Instead, they carry on and they settle in Nazareth, where Jesus is brought up. Now, that's recorded in two Gospels. It's in the start of the Gospel of Matthew. It's in the early chapters of the Gospel of Luke, and you can see that most of the events don't appear in both Gospels. Some of them do. The fact that the birth of Jesus is a miracle, that's in both Matthew and Luke. Both of them say that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and they end up saying that Joseph, Mary, and Jesus settle in Nazareth. But the rest of the events are usually only carried by one gospel. It's clear the two aren't dependent on one another. These are independent witnesses to what happened. So what are the objections? Why do people say they don't like the birth narratives of Jesus? Well, here are some of them. First of all, they say the account's only in two gospels. It's not in the Gospel of Mark. It's not in the letters. If it's that important, then why isn't it in all the rest of the Gospels? And they objected on that count. They say there are lots of parallels with Greek mythology. There are plenty of gods in Greek mythology who were born to virgins. It's just a copy of a Greek myth. And they also say, and it's parallel with Old Testament prophecy. So it's there because people have read the Old Testament, seen what they want to fulfill, and then put that on Jesus. The Star of Bethlehem, they said, no contemporary record of the Star of Bethlehem. So you can't believe that either. The slaughter of children, they say, it's not mentioned. The historians never talk about it. So doesn't that mean there's something wrong with the gospel accounts? And the census is objected to on a whole load of grounds. The idea that it wouldn't have happened, and if it did happen, it wouldn't have happened the way it is in the Gospels. Well, we'll take a look at those and we'll see what the real evidence shows. So first of all, the question of the virgin birth. The argument here is it only is found in 2 Gospels. If it's important, and it does seem to be important in the Gospels, it really is important, then why only in 2 Gospels and nowhere else? Well, this is a bit of a problem. That the evidence really doesn't support that objection. First of all, it's an argument from silence. Arguments from silence are always very dangerous in ancient documents. All sorts of things that happened in history, we know they happened because we've got archaeological evidence for them, that are hardly mentioned by contemporary historians. So, for example, the eruption of Pompeii is recorded by one historian, one person who wrote about it, in spite of the fact that we know that half a dozen people who wrote books in the ancient world had visited Pompeii quite close to the time of the eruption. Fire of Rome, again, it's mentioned by people who were writing in the early 2nd century, not mentioned in the 1st century. We know it happened because there's a layer of ash in the ruins of Rome. The archaeologists look for it and find it, but it's not mentioned very much by 1st century. In fact, it's not mentioned at all by 1st century writers. So arguments from silence are always very dangerous, especially ones in the sort of time of the Gospels. But in fact, there's a bit more evidence than people say. First of all, well, their accounts in Matthew and Luke are very detailed. There's much less detail, but there are allusions to the virgin birth elsewhere. For example, this verse in the letter of Paul to the Galatians. It says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman. Now, to me, that sounds very like the virgin birth. It doesn't say born to a human family, born to human parents. It says he's the Son of God, born of a woman. And that's a really good summary of the virgin birth. Now, Galatians is quite possibly the first book of the New Testament to be written. It's written probably early in 48 AD by the Apostle Paul. And so the Apostle Paul knew about the virgin birth, and he writes about it in Galatians, his first letter. So we've got another person who writes, and that's the Apostle Paul. What about this? This is in the Gospel of John. Remember, John's Gospel's written after Luke, after Mark, after Paul wrote most of his letters. John can read probably some of the other Gospels. He can read the letters of Paul. And you have this little quotation in John where Jesus is in an altercation with the authorities in the province of Judea. And they sort of try and hit at him by saying, we're not born of sexual immorality. They know there's something irregular about the birth of Jesus, and they're trying to suggest that it's to do with sexual immorality. So John almost certainly knows about the virgin birth. And you've got this little sideways allusion to it. So we've got another witness. And the point is, the virgin birth isn't just down to 2 Gospels. 2 Gospels contain most of the detail, but it's there elsewhere in the New Testament. And of course, the Apostolic Fathers, the people who are writing Christian documents just after the New Testament, also refer to the virgin birth. It's something that's known from the earliest moments of Christianity. What else? Well, there are the parallels with Greek myth. Now, these are quite odd when you look at them, but the claim is that many Greek gods had virgin births, and that the Christians are taking over these Greek myths and are applying them to Jesus. Now, in fact, the accounts that you find in the mystery religions that we know of don't refer to virgin births in the sense that Jesus has a virgin birth. In fact, they don't really refer to virgin births at all. A lot of them talk about gods and goddesses having a sort of family and producing more gods. Some of them refer to a god up in Olympus seeing a particularly beautiful human female and going down and either seducing her or raping her. But neither way is it a virgin birth. So you get things like the Horus myth. Now, Horus myths are spoken of a lot, but the mother isn't a human virgin. She's a goddess. She's the widow of Osiris. She's been married to him for an incredibly long length of time. And Horus is born by, well, it's a slightly extraordinary version of it, but by sexual means in the ordinary way. Isis is not a virgin at the birth of Horus or anywhere near it. So they're not virgin births. They're nothing like the story of the birth of Jesus. There's no real parallel there whatsoever. Look at one particular one, Mithras. This is the other one that gets a really big push from the people who want to use it as a criticism of the Gospels. They say Mithras had a virgin birth attended by shepherds and kings, and he was born on the 25th of December. There you go, just like Jesus. It's not just like Jesus at all. First of all, we don't know a lot about Mithraism. It was a secret religion. There are no Mithraic scriptures we can read to find out exactly what happened. We have to find out from inscriptions and from reliefs in Mithraea, the temples of Mithras. The 25th of December date, for example, comes from late comments about Mithraism. It may or be not a correct description of Mithraism. Shepherds and the kings don't appear anywhere in any inscription or in any picture of Mithras. Of course, the problem with the 25th of December date is that, according to the Bible, there's no reason to suppose that Jesus was born on the 25th of December. Quite the opposite. There were shepherds in the fields. That doesn't happen in the winter, or didn't happen in the winter at that time in Judea or in Galilee, certainly not in Judea. What happened is the animals were brought in the winter and kept indoors for a while. The shepherds would have been inside. If you do the calculations, you find that Jesus was probably born in the early autumn. There's a minority opinion that says somewhere around Easter time, but not on the 25th of December. So that parallel goes. And of course, Mithras wasn't born of a virgin. In fact, he wasn't born of a woman at all. That's a statue of Mithras from the Baths of Diocletian. And there's Mithras coming into existence. He's a full adult. There he is. He's got a sword. He's got a torch, which Mithras seems to carry in the statues and inscriptions. And if you look at the bottom, if you read in Latin, you can see that he is generated from a rock. So Mithras is springing out of a rock. He's springing as an adult from a rock. He doesn't have a mother of any ordinary kind that you can imagine. So there's absolutely no parallel whatsoever with the birth of Jesus there. The parallel fails completely. And if you go through all these different pagan myths, the mystery religions or the classical Greek religion, you'll find that there are no virgin births like the birth of Jesus. What about the Old Testament prophecy? Well, there are three prophecies that Matthew talks of as fulfillments of Old Testament prophecy. There they are. There's the Emmanuel prophecy from Isaiah. There's the prophecy that a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and weeping, Rachel weeping for her children because they are no more, in Jeremiah. And there's Hosea 11 verse 1, where God calls his son out of Egypt. Now, the interesting thing is we know how people interpreted the Old Testament at the time of Jesus, because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have rabbinic writings, we have Jewish apocrypha from just about the time of Jesus or just a little bit earlier. And none of those passages is seen as messianic in Jewish literature. None of them is thought of as a prediction of what the Messiah was going to be like. And in fact, if you look at them, you wouldn't automatically think of those as a prediction of Jesus, unless you knew how Jesus was born. If you knew how Jesus was born and you look back into the Old Testament, you might find things which talk about things that happened to Jesus. So those are not ones that people were expecting to talk about the Messiah. These are ones which having seen how the Messiah was born, you might suddenly realize are prophecies of the Messiah coming. So they're not obvious. They're only obvious once you know how Jesus was born. So we need to think what we've really got is something which is telling us this is the way that Jesus really was born. The Star of Bethlehem. The statement is that it's not reported by contemporary Roman astronomers. That's true, but there's a reason for it. We don't have the writings of any contemporary Roman astronomers. At least we have fragments, but only fragments. We don't have a comprehensive picture. So we don't know whether Roman astronomers spoke about it or not. We haven't got their records. We have got records from Chinese astronomers, and they give us several possible alternatives. So we've got an argument from silence, but it's an argument that's contradicted by Chinese astronomers. And there were several things that were either comets or supernovae. We don't know which, because the Chinese word for comet and supernova at that time was the same. But there are records that stars were seen that you wouldn't normally have expected to see. So it could have been one of those. There are a couple of conjunctions where planets get very close together. Those might have indicated the birth of Jesus to someone who had the right information beforehand. Or it may have been a miracle. It may have been a local phenomenon which was there in the atmosphere that was only visible in wherever the wise men came from and in Judea. We don't know which of those it was. We don't have enough information, but there's no reason to suppose that one of them didn't indicate to the wise men that there was a king being born in Bethlehem. Slaughter of children in Bethlehem. It's not mentioned by Josephus. It's not mentioned by Philo, but you wouldn't expect it to. Philo doesn't write about the excesses of Herod. He only writes about the excesses of the Roman governors, and Herod wasn't a Roman governor. It's not mentioned by Josephus, but actually we wouldn't expect it to be. Again, it's an argument from silence. It's one of these things that, when they happen, doesn't get reported by Roman historians, but Roman historians are very selective in what they report, and things we would think of reporting, often they don't. But in this case, there's a good reason why Josephus didn't report it. If you think how big Bethlehem was, archaeologists estimate that the population was probably around 1,000 people. Might have been as high as 1,200 people, but no higher than that. Let's take the 1,000 because it makes the arithmetic easy. So let's again take a nice round number, supposing that people expect to live till they're 50. It's a bit earlier than now. They live longer than that, then fewer children. That would mean the number of children that were born to maintain a population of 1,000 would be about 20 babies a year. So children under the age of 2, there's 40 of them. Half of those will be girls, and no girl's ever going to be a king, might be a queen, but never be a king. So that's 20 children. It's not as though the streets are running in rivers of blood. This is a small number of children being killed. Now, Josephus, when he mentions great atrocities, he mentions things where you're talking about several hundred people killed. Or he talks about things that are politically significant. And that's a very small number compared to the massacres that Philo talks about with the governors, or that Josephus records for us. Probably they wouldn't have reported it even if they knew about it. So you wouldn't expect an ancient historian to report the slaughter of children in Bethlehem by Herod, and they don't. Last of all, the census. This is the passage here, and the objections are quite comprehensive, a lot of them. First of all, they say, well, Quirinius wasn't a governor until 10 years after Herod the Great died, so the two of them don't overlap. How could you have Herod ordering a registration which is there when Quirinius is governor of Syria? Now, okay, there are slight problems. There might have been an earlier term of office of Quirinius. There are one or two suggestions from inscriptions that Quirinius had more than one term of office, but we don't know when his other one was, if he had one. He was governor in 6 AD when Herod finally died, when Herod Archelaus is deposed, beg your pardon. We don't have any records of this census. There are records of some censuses in the Roman world, but there's no record of this particular one in Judea. There's the frequently mentioned comment that Roman censuses didn't require people to go back to their ancestral homes. So why is Joseph going back to his ancestral home? Some people say Mary wouldn't need to be counted. She's a woman. They wouldn't consider counting a woman anyway. And finally, there's the comment that Herod's kingdom is outside the Roman Empire. So why does a decree of Caesar Augustus matter to Herod? Well, what these are showing is a lack of understanding of how Romans did censuses. So what happens? Well, in 27 BC, Augustus became the first emperor. Before that, Rome was a republic. Augustus makes it an empire. And it has a sort of ad hoc set of colonies and provinces all over the place. Augustus organizes these. He decides to organize them and make them into a coherent empire. And to do that, he declares that every province has to have a proper census system set up and to have a census. But it doesn't happen overnight. He's not saying there's a certain date on which I want a census. He's saying I want a census in every province of the Roman Empire. And that required time. In Egypt, it only took about 10 or 11 years. In Gaul, it took them 40 years to organize the census. So the census started with a registration, but carried on going, and it was 40 years later that they decided they finally got a proper record of what was going on in the province of Gaul. 40 years. That means you don't expect it all to happen in a very short time. It takes ages. So if Herod the Great starts a census, you start off with an original registration, that could easily drag on until long after the death of Herod the Great to the governorship of Quirinius. The 10th census was used as a means of ruling the province. It allowed them to collect taxes, it allowed them to know where the people were, have some idea what was going on in the province, and it was a way of telling the people in the province, the emperor knows what is going on. The emperor understands what's happening in your town. He knows who you are. He knows who your family are. There's a good way of controlling a province. And you can imagine Herod the Great saying, I can see what all these Romans are doing. I'm sort of in the Roman world. I'm a client king. I'm going to do the same thing. It's going to help me rule Judea the same way it helps Augustus rule Egypt. And so the census moves on into Palestine as well. If you want to look this up, look at the paper I've got at the bottom there from Claytor and Bagnall in the Journal of Greek, Roman and Byzantine Studies. It's really discussing a new papyrus they've discovered and just read, but it has a lot of background as to how the Roman Empire managed its censuses. What happens in the case of the birth of Jesus? Well, the decree goes out from Caesar Augustus that the whole world's going to be registered. It's going to set up a census system. And this is the registration that's going on still when Quirinius becomes governor of Syria. We don't have to assume that decrees that there's a certain day when everybody in the world is going to be counted. That's a modern assumption, well, sort of. And we don't have to assume that the census only takes a month or so to do, because that's what happens nowadays. But in the Roman world, they're setting up a census system, in much of it from scratch. Places like Egypt already had a census, but it probably Judea and Galilee didn't. Certainly Gaul didn't. Arabia didn't for later on. And we have some evidence as to how these censuses took place. So what we have to do is to make sure we're not making 21st century assumptions. So the assumptions that the critics are making aren't 21st century assumptions, they're 19th century assumptions. These are assumptions that were made in Victorian England and are sort of carried on through, even though we know better. There's a fair bit of evidence about these censuses. That's a census return, a papyrus that's been found in Egypt. There are a fair number of these around. They can follow whole families through several generations by looking at their census returns. And here is a particular papyrus which gives instructions on how to conduct the census. And it's from Gaius Bibius Maximus, who is the prefect of Egypt. He's doing a census, 2nd century, but nonetheless the method is probably that of all the other censuses. And he says that it is necessary for people to return to, he says, their domestic hearths. They have to go back to their homes so that they can be counted properly and so they can carry on living in the household. So what's happening in the case of Joseph? Why is he going back to Bethlehem? Well, the reason is that's where he came from. It's the home of people like Joseph. He's a descendant of David, and that's where David was born, and Joseph carried on living there, as did much of the family, for a long time afterwards. Somehow he's gone to Nazareth. There he's got engaged to Mary, but he's still registered back in Bethlehem, and that's where he has to go back to in order to register himself for census purposes, just as people did in Egypt. He brings Mary with him. It's his ancestral home. Probably that's where he intends to settle. So he and Mary are going to bring up their family back in Bethlehem, the place where Joseph comes from. And so they travel back there in order to live there. And it's a census which is using the same practice that's used elsewhere in the Roman world. Okay, let's put together what we've seen. Let's see how the various different objections go. We've got the objection that Quirinius was governor 10 years after Herod's death, but this talking about a census process which starts off at the end of Herod's reign and which carries on into the reign or the governorship of Quirinius, which is 10 years after Herod's death, but that's quite short for the organizing of a census in the ancient world. No record of this census. Well, no, census records were written on papyrus. Papyrus survives quite a long time in the dry sands of Egypt, but in Palestine, unless you're down on the Dead Sea, papyrus just rots away over a few centuries, and you don't find records anymore unless you're incredibly lucky and it's kept very, very safe. So we haven't got a record of the census because the records have simply perished. Well, again, we know that people are required to return to the registered homes. We've got a papyrus that tells us about it. Question, Mary didn't need to be counted. Well, women are counted in Egypt. In Arabia, they count women, animals, children, land, everything. Slightly different in different provinces. And Herod's kingdom outside the Roman Empire, well, Herod has the same reasons for having a census that Augustus has. So Augustus's reforms are something Herod would easily want to take up. So what's happening? Augustus declares a census throughout the Roman Empire. He declares the general reform to take place. Herod the Great sees the advantage to himself, which starts his own arrangement, and that continues to be used and is finished in the time of Quirinius. And Jesus is born in the earliest part of that process, in the original initial registration part of the process. Interesting thing is that we know that Matthew is actually quite accurate in his description of what's going on. He's generally historically quite good. Here's the bit at the end of the birth narrative when the family are returning from Egypt. It says that when Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea, he was afraid to go there. Why? Well, Archelaus, well, first of all, it talks about him reigning over Judea, but it doesn't call him king. And Archelaus was not appointed as king. He was appointed as a sort of subsidiary official, also appointed as ethnarch, ruler of the Jews in that province. Wasn't even king of the whole province. They were probably a tetrarch. Secondly, they go to Galilee. Why? Because Galilee isn't ruled by Archelaus, and he's afraid to go there because Archelaus was a murderous and a paranoid ruler. And knowing that, Joseph carries on, and he carries on until he's just gone over the border. In fact, he's gone back to Nazareth, where Mary came from, and he lives there in the place ruled by Antipas rather than by Archelaus. Archelaus rules until 6 AD, by which time Jesus will be about 12, maybe 11, 10, 11, 12, that kind of age. Interestingly, the first time we know he goes to Jerusalem for the Passover is 12 years old, just after Archelaus has died. It fits together rather nicely, even though the visit to Jerusalem is in the Gospel of Luke, and this thing about being afraid of Archelaus is in the Gospel of Matthew. So the other one, Luke, the other record, we know that Luke's an accurate reporter. It's absolutely universally acknowledged that Luke is an accurate reporter of historical facts. Can we believe it? Should we believe the birth accounts of Jesus? Well, we've got two detailed accounts, completely independent of one another, but which fit together and don't contradict one another. They're consistent with the events of the time. They fit into a deep look at the way things were carried out and the way things went on. Luke is known to report things accurately. They're there in Acts of the Apostles particularly, and here we have him being equally accurate about the birth of Jesus. And we know that Matthew gives an accurate picture of the reign of Archelaus. So there's no reason not to believe the gospel accounts of Jesus' birth. It looks as though they're accurate. They are accurate, and we can be very confident of that fact. Well, the Gospel Online channel has a whole series of videos on the Gospel of Jesus and the Apostles and why you can believe that gospel. So subscribe to the channel for more videos, or go and look at the channel and see if you're interested in some of the other videos that are already there.